The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Book the Second. Chapter 1, which begins to treat of the dark night of the spirit, and says at what time it begins. The soul which God is about to lead onward is not led by His Majesty into this night of the spirit as soon as it goes forth from the aridities and trials of the first purgation and night of sense. Rather, it is wont to pass a long time, even years, after leaving the state of beginners, in exercising itself in that of proficients. In this latter state, it is like to one that has come forth from a rigorous imprisonment. It goes about the things of God with much greater freedom and satisfaction of the soul, and with more abundant and inward delight than it did at the beginning, before it entered the said night. For its imagination and faculties are no longer bound, as they were before, by meditation and anxiety of spirit, since it now very readily finds in its spirit the most serene and loving contemplation and spiritual sweetness, without the labor of meditation. Although, as the purgation of the soul is not complete, for the principal part thereof, which is that of the spirit, is wanting, without which, owing to the communication that exists between the one part and the other, since the subject is one only, the purgation of sense, however violent it may have been, is not yet complete and perfect. It is never without certain occasional necessities, aridities, darknesses, and perils, which are sometimes much more intense than those of the past, for they are tokens and heralds of the coming night of the spirit, and are not of as long a duration as will be the night which is to come. For having passed through a period or periods or days of this night and tempest, the soul soon returns to its wonted serenity. And after this manner God purges certain souls which are not to rise to so high a degree of love as are others, bringing them at times, and for short periods, into this night of contemplation and purgation of the spirit, causing night to come upon them, and then dawn, and this frequently, so that the words of David may be fulfilled, that he sends his crystal, that is, his contemplation, like morsels, although these morsels of dark contemplation are never as intense as is that terrible night of contemplation which we are to describe, into which, of set purpose, God brings the soul, that He may lead it to divine union. This sweetness, then, and this interior pleasure which we are describing, and which these progressives find and experience in their spirits so easily and so abundantly, is communicated to them in much greater abundance than aforetime, overflowing into their senses more than was usual previously to this purgation of sense. For inasmuch as the sense is now purer, it can more easily feel the pleasures of the spirit after its manner. As, however, this sensual part of the soul is weak and incapable of experiencing the strong things of the spirit, it follows that these proficients, by reason of this spiritual communication which is made to their sensual part, endure therein many frailties and sufferings and weaknesses of the stomach, and in consequence are fatigued in spirit. For as the wise man says, the corruptible body presses down the soul. Hence comes it that the communications that are granted to these souls cannot be very strong, or very intense, or very spiritual, as is required for divine union with God, by reason of the weakness and corruption of the sensual nature which has a part in them. Hence arise the raptures and trances and dislocations of the bones, which always happen when the communications are not purely spiritual, that is, are not given to the Spirit alone, as are those of the perfect who are purified by the second night of the Spirit, and in whom these raptures and torments of the body no longer exist, since they are enjoying liberty of spirit, and their senses are now neither clouded nor transported. And in order that the necessity for such souls to enter this night of the Spirit may be understood, we will here note certain imperfections and perils which belong to these proficients. Chapter 2 describes other imperfections which belong to these proficients. These proficients have two kinds of imperfection. The one kind is habitual, the other actual. The habitual imperfections are the imperfect habits and affections which have remained all the time in the spirit, and are like roots to which the purgation of sense has been unable to penetrate. The difference between the purgation of these and that of this other kind is the difference between the root and the branch, or between the removing of a stain which is fresh and one which is old and of long standing. For as we said, the purgation of sense is only the entrance and beginning of contemplation leading to the purgation of spirit, which, as we have likewise said, serves rather to accommodate sense to spirit than to unite spirit to God. But there still remain in the spirit the stains of the old man, though the spirit thinks not that this is so, neither can it perceive them. If these stains be not removed with the soap and strong lye of the purgation of this night, the spirit will be unable to come to the purity of divine union. Lye as in lye soap. These souls have likewise the habituo mentis and the natural roughness which every man contracts through sin, and the distraction and outward clinging of the spirit, which must be enlightened, refined, and recollected by the afflictions and perils of that night. These habitual imperfections belong to all those who have not passed beyond this state of the proficient. They cannot coexist, as we say, with the perfect state of union through love. To actual imperfections, all are not liable in the same way. Some, whose spiritual good is so superficial and so readily affected by sense, fall into greater difficulties and dangers, which we described at the beginning of this treatise. For as they find so many and such abundant spiritual communications and apprehensions, both in sense and in spirit, wherein they oftentimes see imaginary and spiritual visions, for all these things, together with other delectable feelings, come to many souls in this state, wherein the devil and their own fancy very commonly practice deceptions on them. And as the devil is apt to take such pleasure in impressing upon the soul and suggesting to it the said apprehensions and feelings, he fascinates and deludes it with great ease, unless it take the precaution of resigning itself to God, and of protecting itself strongly, by means of faith, from all these visions and feelings. For in this state the devil causes many to believe in vain visions and false prophecies, and strives to make them presume that God and the saints are speaking to them, and they often trust their own fancy. And the devil is also accustomed in this state to fill them with presumption and pride, so that they become attracted by vanity and arrogance, and allow themselves to be seen engaging in outward acts which appear holy, such as raptures and other manifestations. Thus they become bold with God and lose holy fear, which is the key and custodian of all the virtues. And in some of these souls so many are the falsehoods and deceits which tend to multiply, and so inveterate do they grow, that it is very doubtful that such souls will return to the pure road of virtue and true spirituality. Into these miseries they fall, because they are beginning to give themselves over to spiritual feelings and apprehensions with too great of security, when they were beginning to make some progress upon the way. There is much more that I might say of these imperfections, and of how they are the more incurable, because such souls consider themselves to be more spiritual than the others. But I will leave this subject. I shall only add, in order to prove how necessary for him that would go farther is the night of the spirit, which is purgation, that none of these proficients, however strenuously he may have labored, is free, at best, from many of those natural affections and imperfect habits, purification from which, we said, is necessary if a soul is to pass to divine union. And over and above this, as we have said already, inasmuch as the lower part of the soul still has a share in these spiritual communications, they cannot be as intense, as pure, and as strong as is needful for the aforesaid union. Wherefore, in order to come to this union, the soul must needs enter into the second night of the spirit, wherein it must strip sense and spirit perfectly from all these apprehensions and from all sweetness, and be made to walk in dark and pure faith, which is the proper and adequate means whereby the soul is united with God, according as Hosea says in these words, I will betroth thee, that is, I will unite thee with me through faith. End of chapter 2 of book 2.